A gang of ruthless bikers storms into a small-town diner, throwing their weight around and terrorizing everyone in sight. But when they corner a quiet waitress named Riley Harper, they make a deadly mistake, because beneath her unassuming apron lies the razor-sharp training of a former Delta Force operative. Riley's fought through war zones and survived missions that would break most people. But now her biggest battle isn't overseas. It's in her own backyard, defending the innocent and finding her own path to redemption. What happens next will shock you. Before we dive in, buckle up, get ready, and don't forget to subscribe. There's a special surprise coming your way tomorrow. The morning sun streamed through the wide windows of the roadside diner, casting long beams across the checkered floor. Riley Harper wiped down the counter with practiced ease, her movements efficient but careful. The radio hummed softly in the background, a mix of country songs and local news. To anyone watching, she looked like just another waitress, quiet, capable, and easily overlooked. That was the way Riley preferred it. The diner buzzed with its usual mix of truckers, regulars, and travelers passing through the small town. A young busboy, Danny, nervously cleared plates from a corner table, avoiding eye contact with the grizzled truckers, joking loudly nearby. "Riley, we're out of coffee filters," he called out, his voice cracking. Riley gave him a small, reassuring smile and a nod. "I'll grab some from the back," she replied, her tone calm. As she moved toward the supply closet, Riley caught sight of a man at the counter, a veteran, judging by the patch sewn onto his jacket. He sat quietly, staring into his coffee, lost in thought. For a brief moment, Riley hesitated, her gaze dropping to her forearm, where her Delta Force tattoo was hidden beneath the sleeve of her uniform. She shook off the thought and went back to work. The bell above the diner's door jingled, and Riley instinctively glanced up. A group of bikers strode in, their boots heavy against the tiled floor. They were big, loud, and carried an air of menace. Their leader, a tall man with a weathered face and cold eyes, scanned the room like a predator surveying prey. Conversations at the tables died down as the gang spread out, claiming space as if they owned it. Riley's heart rate quickened, but her expression didn't change. She stepped back to the counter, her hands steady as she placed a coffee pot on the burner. The bikers, oblivious to her, started ordering beers and food in aggressive tones, tossing insults at Danny when he struggled to keep up. "Hey, sweetheart," one of the bikers sneered, leaning across the counter toward Riley. "You gonna serve us, or do we have to help ourselves?" Riley met his gaze, her voice even. "I'll bring your drinks in a minute. Sit tight." Her calmness seemed to throw him off, and he pulled back with a grunt. Tension simmered as the gang's behavior escalated. One of them shoved Danny hard, enough to make him stumble, sending a tray of plates clattering to the floor. The boy froze, his face pale, and the diner fell silent. Riley moved toward them slowly, her posture unassuming but deliberate. "Enough," she said, her voice low but firm. "Leave him alone." The biker who had shoved Danny turned to Riley, a mocking smile spreading across his face. "And what are you going to do about it, waitress?" he taunted, stepping closer. Riley's eyes narrowed, her grip tightened slightly on the towel in her hand, and she stood her ground. Every muscle in her body was ready, her mind already calculating options. The diner held its breath. Conversations had fallen silent. The scrape of forks against plates stopped, and all eyes were fixed on Riley and the biker, now towering over her. He was big, with arms crisscrossed in faded tattoos and the swagger of someone who thought he owned the world. Behind him, the rest of the gang watched, some smirking, others shifting uncomfortably. Danny, still on the floor where he had fallen, scrambled to gather the broken pieces of the plates, his hands trembling. "You're awfully brave," the biker sneered, leaning down until his face was only inches from Riley's. "You really think you can tell me what to do?" His breath smelled of stale beer and cigarettes, but Riley didn't flinch. "I think you should leave," she said evenly, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife, "before things get out of hand." The man laughed, a sharp bark that made a few of the other bikers chuckle nervously. "Out of hand, lady, you've got no idea what out of hand looks like." He reached for her, grabbing the edge of her apron as if to pull her closer. Riley moved like lightning. Her hand shot out, gripping his wrist with a strength that belied her slim frame. In a single fluid motion, she twisted his arm, forcing him to his knees with a yelp of pain. The diner erupted into gasps and murmurs as Riley stepped back, her posture calm, her grip unwavering. "Walk away," she said, her tone colder now. "You don't want this to get worse." The man struggled against her hold, but Riley's grip was unrelenting. He finally yanked his arm free and staggered back, clutching his wrist as he glared at her with pure venom. "You'll regret that," he spat, backing toward his friends. "Let's go." The leader, Cade, growled from his spot by the door. His voice was low, but carried authority, and the bikers obeyed, albeit reluctantly. As they filed out, Cade lingered, locking eyes with Riley. His expression wasn't anger or surprise. It was something harder to read, something calculating. "You've got guts," he said after a moment, his voice quiet. "But guts only get you so far. We'll see you again, Waitress." He tipped an imaginary hat, then turned and walked out, leaving the door swinging behind him. As the roar of motorcycles faded into the distance, the diner seemed to exhale all at once. Danny scrambled to his feet, his face pale and his hands shaking. "Riley," he stammered, that was insane. Who even are you?" Riley didn't answer. She grabbed a fresh towel and began wiping down the counter as if nothing had happened. The tension in her shoulders betrayed her calm exterior, but she didn't let it show. "Back to work, Danny," she said softly, her voice steady. "We've got a busy day ahead." But as she cleaned, Riley couldn't shake the weight of Cade's words. She knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting long shadows over the parking lot outside the diner. Inside, Riley moved through her closing routine with methodical precision. The other employees had gone home, leaving her alone to lock up. She turned off the radio, the silence in the diner now thick and heavy. Her mind wasn't on the usual end-of-shift tasks. It was on Cade's parting words. "You've got guts, but guts only get you so far." Riley replayed the encounter in her head, assessing every move she'd made and every look Cade had given her. His calm, measured tone had unsettled her more than the physical threat of his men. Men like Cade didn't bluff. He was calculating, someone who'd seen his fair share of conflict and knew how to exploit weakness. Riley paused as she wiped down the counter, her eyes drifting to the clock. The quiet buzz of the fluorescent lights filled the space. For a moment, she let herself wonder if she'd gone too far, not because she regretted standing up to them, but because she knew what came next. People like the Iron Wolves didn't let things go. Her thoughts were interrupted by the distant growl of motorcycle engines. She froze, her grip tightening on the towel in her hand. The sound grew louder, closer, until it filled the air outside the diner. Riley moved to the window, staying just out of sight, and peeked through the blinds. The Iron Wolves had returned. At least a dozen bikes were parked in the lot, their riders dismounting and gathering near the door. Cade stood at the front, a presence commanding, even in the dim light. Riley's pulse quickened, but her breathing remained steady. She reached beneath the counter and retrieved a small duffel bag she kept hidden there. Inside were a few essentials she hoped she'd never have to use again: zip ties, a tactical flashlight, and a small, well-worn combat knife. The bikers didn't burst in immediately. Instead, they lingered outside, talking in low voices. Cade seemed to be giving orders, pointing toward the diner and gesturing toward the surrounding area. Riley realized he was covering all the exits. "Smart," she muttered under her breath, her lips pressed into a thin line. She took a deep breath, centering herself. The instincts she'd buried since leaving Delta Force resurfaced, sharp and undeniable. This wasn't a fight she could avoid, and it wasn't one she could win with words alone. The bell above the door jingled as it opened. Cade stepped inside, followed by two of his men. He stopped just past the threshold, scanning the diner with the same calculating gaze he'd had earlier. When his eyes landed on Riley, he smiled, a slow, deliberate smile that didn't reach his eyes. "We weren't finished earlier," he said, his voice calm but laced with menace. "Thought we'd come back and settle things proper." Riley straightened, her hands at her sides but ready to move in an instant. "You don't want to do this," she said, her tone as steady as her heartbeat. Cade tilted his head, the smile never leaving his face. "I think we do." The air in the diner felt suffocating, heavy with the tension that settled between Riley and Cade. His men stood just behind him, their eyes scanning the room, their stances brimming with barely contained aggression. Riley stayed rooted behind the counter, her gaze locked on Cade's. She wasn't afraid, not of him, not of his crew, but she knew this situation was a delicate one. "You've got a lot of nerve," Cade said, leaning casually against a booth, though his posture radiated menace. "Taking down my guys like that, not many people would dare." "I'm not most people," Riley replied evenly. Her voice was calm, steady, but her eyes never left Cade's. She was reading him, watching his every move, every subtle shift in his expression. Cade chuckled, the sound low and humorless. "Yeah, I'm starting to see that, but here's the thing. You embarrassed me and you embarrassed my crew. That's a problem." "Your guys came in here looking for trouble," Riley said, her tone sharp now. "I told them to leave. They didn't listen." Cade raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued by her defiance. "You're bold, I'll give you that. But bold doesn't mean untouchable. I can't let this slide." Riley's jaw tightened. She shifted slightly, her stance more deliberate, her weight balanced on the balls of her feet. She glanced past Cade at the other two bikers. They weren't paying close attention to her. Rookie mistake. "So what now?" she asked, her tone carefully neutral. Cade smirked. "That depends on you. Maybe you apologize, beg a little, and we let it go. Or maybe..." He let the words hang in the air, the unspoken threat clear. Riley didn't respond. She reached for the coffee pot on the counter, her movements slow, deliberate. Cade's eyes flicked to her hand, and she saw the faintest hint of tension in his shoulders. He wasn't sure what she was going to do. Good. The sound of engines outside grew louder. More bikes were pulling in. Riley didn't glance toward the window. She didn't need to. She already knew she was outnumbered, but that didn't change. Her plan? "I think you and your boys should leave," she said, her voice cutting through the tension. Cade straightened, his smirk vanishing. "You don't give orders here, Waitress." He nodded to one of his men who stepped forward. The biker reached for Riley, but she was already moving. In a blur, she swung the coffee pot, smashing it into his face. He staggered back with a shout, clutching his nose as blood poured down. His hand. Before anyone could react, Riley vaulted over the counter, landing in a low crouch. The second biker lunged at her, but she sidestepped, grabbing his arm and twisting it behind his back. A sharp cry escaped his lips as she forced him to the ground. Cade didn't move, his expression shifting from anger to something darker. Respect. "You've got skills," he muttered, his voice low. Riley released the second man, who scrambled, away, groaning in pain. "Last chance," she said, her tone ice cold. "Get out." Cade stared at her for a long moment, then signaled to his men. "We're leaving," he said. As they retreated, he stopped at the door, turning back to Riley. "This isn't over," he promised. The door closed behind them, and the diner was silent again. Riley exhaled, her pulse pounding. She knew Cade meant every word. This was just the beginning. The roar of the bikes faded into the night, but the weight of Cade's promise lingered in the air long after the diner returned to silence. Riley stood motionless for a moment, her hands resting on the counter to steady herself. Her breathing was controlled, but her mind raced. Cade wasn't bluffing, and she knew it. Men like him didn't take humiliation lightly, and the way he'd walked out so calmly only meant he was planning something bigger. By the time Riley locked the doors and walked out to her truck, the stars were out, scattered across the inky black sky. She scanned the parking lot as she approached her vehicle, her eyes darting to every shadow and dark corner. The habit was automatic, drilled into her through years of training. She wasn't paranoid, she was prepared. Sliding into the driver's seat, Riley allowed herself a moment to breathe. She rested her hands on the steering wheel, her fingers brushing against the small metal charm hanging from the keychain, an eagle insignia, faded and worn. It was the only physical reminder of her time in Delta Force that she allowed herself to keep. As she drove home, her thoughts were heavy. It wasn't just about the danger Cade and his gang posed to her. She'd brought this down on the diner, on Danny, and the regulars who came in every day without a care in the world. That guilt pressed on her chest, even as she told herself she'd done what was necessary. Cade, meanwhile, was already regrouping. In the dimly lit garage on the outskirts of town, the Iron Wolves were gathered, their bikes lined up in neat rows. Cade stood at the center, his hands resting on a long metal table where maps, phones, and a few weapons were laid out. The gang's second in command, a wiry man named Riggs, leaned against the wall, a cigarette dangling from his lips. "We can't just let her get away with that," Riggs said, exhaling a cloud of smoke. "She humiliated us, twice." "I know," Cade replied, his tone measured. He wasn't the type to explode in anger. His fury simmered under the surface, cold and calculated. "But this isn't just about payback. That woman, she's not normal. She's a waitress," Riggs scoffed. "She's not," Cade snapped, his voice sharp enough to cut through the room. He paused, running a hand through his hair. "She's trained. The way she moves, the way she fights. I've seen it before." Riggs frowned. "Military? Maybe," Cade said. "Probably, but it doesn't matter. What matters is that she's a threat, and threats need to be handled." "What's the plan?" another biker asked from the corner. Cade leaned over the table, tapping a finger on the map. "We hit her where it hurts, not just her but the people around her. Make her regret ever crossing us." As the gang began to strategize, Riley sat in her modest home, staring out the window into the dark woods beyond. Her gut told her Cade wasn't finished, and the uneasy quiet of the night only confirmed it. She reached for her phone and hesitated, her thumb hovering over the contact list. Finally, she made the call. "Hey," she said when the familiar voice answered. "I might need some help." The following evening, the diner was busier than usual. Truckers filled the booths, chatting loudly over steaming plates of food, while locals sipped coffee and laughed at jokes shared between tables. The hum of conversation and clatter of dishes created a sense of comfort, a reminder of the small-town normalcy Riley had grown to appreciate. But she couldn't relax. Her instincts told her something was coming, and the longer the night stretched on, the more her nerves tightened. She kept her eyes on the door, watching every customer who entered. Her movements were fluid and purposeful, but her mind was elsewhere, calculating escape routes, gauging threats. Danny noticed her tension and leaned in as they passed each other behind the counter. "You okay?" he whispered. "Fine," Riley replied, though her clipped tone said, "Otherwise." She forced a small smile to reassure him, but Danny wasn't convinced. The bell over the door jingled, and Riley's heart sank as Cade walked in, flanked by 4 of his men. They were dressed the same as before, leather jackets, heavy boots, but there was an edge to their presence now, a quiet menace that hung in the air like smoke. Cade scanned the room, his eyes lingering on each face, and then he smiled. "Evening, folks," he said, his voice smooth and friendly. "Mind if we join the party?" The din of conversation faded as heads turned toward the newcomers. Cade and his men spread out, taking seats at different tables. The tension was palpable, the kind that made people lower their voices and look anywhere but directly at the bikers. Riley straightened her posture, her jaw tightening as she stepped out from behind the counter. Cade caught her movement and raised a hand, as if to wave her over. "Riley, wasn't it?" he said, his smile sharp and mocking. "Be a dear and bring us a round of coffee, would you?" The room was silent now, every patron waiting to see how she would respond. Riley met Cade's gaze, her expression unreadable. "You're not welcome here," she said evenly, her voice carrying through the diner. Cade tilted his head, his smile never wavering. "That's not very hospitable of you. We're paying customers, aren't we?" Before Riley could respond, one of Cade's men stood up and locked the front door with an audible click. The sound sent a ripple of fear through the room. "Why? Don't we make this a private party?" Cade said, leaning back in his chair. "Just us and the fine folks here." Riley's pulse quickened, but her expression remained calm. Her eyes darted to the locked door, the scattered tables, and the frightened faces of the patrons. Cade wasn't just here to intimidate. This was a calculated move, a way to assert control and draw her out. "Let them go," Riley said, her voice steady. Cade chuckled, shaking his head. "Oh, we're just getting started. But here's the thing, you're the guest of honor tonight." The sound of chairs scraping against the floor as his men stood sent a clear message. They weren't leaving until they got what they came for. Riley's eyes narrowed, her mind already forming a plan. She took a step forward, her stance shifting as she prepared for what was about to come. "Fine," she said quietly, her voice like steel, "but you're going to regret this." The air in the diner was electric, charged with tension that prickled against the skin. Riley stood her ground, her eyes fixed on Cade as his men began to spread out, taking positions near the doors and windows. The patrons huddled together in their booths, whispering nervously among themselves. Danny edged closer to Riley, his face pale, but determined not to abandon her. Cade leaned back in his chair, exuding a casual confidence that only made the threat feel more dangerous. "You know, Riley," he said, swirling his coffee cup lazily, "you're starting to make me wonder. You're not just some waitress, are you?" Riley didn't answer. She was already scanning the room, mapping out exits, potential weapons, and angles of attack. The key to surviving situations like this wasn't brute strength, it was preparation and control. "Cat got your tongue?" Cade asked, smirking. "Or maybe you're thinking about how this could all end a lot easier if you'd just apologize and do what you're told." Her gaze snapped back to him, and for a moment, her composure cracked, letting a sliver of fire show. "You don't scare me," she said flatly. Cade's smirk widened. "Oh, I don't have to scare you, sweetheart. I just have to remind you who's in charge here." He gestured to one of his men, who grabbed a plate from a nearby table and hurled it to the ground, shattering it into jagged pieces. The sound made several patrons jump, their fear palpable. Riley's jaw tightened. She needed to act, but she couldn't risk the safety of everyone in the room. Her phone was in her apron pocket, but calling for help would take too long, and the police wouldn't arrive in time to stop whatever Cade was planning. She needed to even the playing field, fast. Danny tugged at her sleeve, his voice barely. A whisper, "What do we do?" She glanced at him, her expression softening for just a moment. "Trust me," she murmured, then turned her attention to the situation at hand. "Let's make this easy," Riley said, raising her voice. "Let everyone go. They don't need to be part of this." Cade feigned consideration, tapping a finger against his chin. "Tempting offer, but I think they'll stay. Good for the atmosphere, you know?" Riley's eyes flicked to the back door, calculating. It wasn't far, but Cade's men were stationed too close. She needed a distraction. Her gaze landed on the coffee pot on the counter, still half full and piping hot. Without warning, she grabbed the pot and hurled its contents toward the closest biker. He let out a sharp cry as the scalding liquid hit his arm, and the chaos that followed was exactly what she needed. Riley moved swiftly, vaulting over the counter and disarming another man before he could react. She grabbed his weapon, a rusty knife, and spun him around, using his body as a shield as Cade's men scrambled to recover from the surprise attack. The patrons seized the opportunity to move, rushing toward the front door as Riley barked orders. "Go now!" she shouted, keeping her focus on the bikers. Cade stood, his calm demeanor finally slipping as he realized the tide was turning. "Get her!" he snarled, but his men hesitated, unsure how to proceed against someone who clearly outmatched them. The room became a blur of movement as Riley methodically fought her way toward the hostages, clearing a path for their escape. She was faster, smarter, and more ruthless than the gang had anticipated, and it showed in their growing uncertainty. By the time the last patron made it out, Riley was left standing alone with Cade and his remaining men. The diner was a mess of overturned chairs and broken glass, the faint smell of burnt coffee lingering in the air. "You should have walked away," she said, her voice low but filled with unmistakable authority. Cade's jaw clenched, his confidence shattered. "This isn't over," he spat, but even he knew the fight was slipping from his grasp. "It is for tonight," Riley replied, taking a measured step forward. "Now leave before I make you regret it." Cade hesitated, then signaled to his men. They retreated slowly, Anger and humiliation etched on their faces as they left. Riley stood in the empty diner, her chest heaving as the adrenaline began to fade. This wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for now she had won. The silence in the diner felt deafening once the roar of the motorcycles disappeared into the distance. Riley leaned against the counter, her hands gripping the edge as she steadied herself. Her chest heaved from exertion, her mind replaying every move she had made during the standoff. She didn't regret her actions. She couldn't, but she knew this was far from over. Cade wasn't the kind of man to let something like this go. Danny re-entered the diner, his face pale and his hands shaking. "Riley," he whispered, his voice trembling. "What just happened? What are we supposed to do now?" Riley looked at him, her expression softening for the first time that evening. She took a step toward him, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You did good, Danny," she said. "You kept your head, and you helped get people out. That's what matters." "But they'll come back, won't they?" he asked, his wide eyes filled with fear. "Probably," Riley admitted, her tone grim. "But I'll handle it." Danny stared at her, his confusion evident. "How? You're just—" He stopped himself, but the words hung in the air. "Just a waitress?" Riley finished for him, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "Not exactly," she sighed, stepping back to survey the damage. Broken chairs, shattered glass, and the lingering smell of burnt coffee filled the space. It wasn't the first time she'd been in a room like this, but she had hoped it would be the last. As Danny helped her clean up, Riley's thoughts drifted to the past she had tried so hard to leave behind. Delta Force had trained her to handle situations like this, to stay calm under pressure, to outthink her enemies, to survive. But that life had come at a cost. She had left it behind to find peace, to live a quiet life, and now it felt like all of it was unraveling. When the diner was as clean as they could manage, Riley walked Danny to his car. She scanned the parking lot, her eyes sweeping over every shadow and corner, before giving him a nod. "Go straight home," she said. "Lock your doors and stay inside. Don't come back until I tell you it's safe." Danny hesitated. "What about you?" "I'll be fine," Riley assured him. "Just trust me." Once Danny drove off, Riley locked the diner and climbed into her truck. She didn't head home. Instead, she drove out to a secluded area on the edge of town, where an old friend had set up a small workshop. The lights were on, spilling out onto the dirt lot as she pulled in. Inside, a man in his 60s looked up from the engine he was tinkering with. He wore a grease-streaked jumpsuit and had a pair of glasses perched on his nose. "Riley," he said, surprised. "Didn't expect to see you here." "I need your help, Frank," Riley said, her tone serious. Frank straightened, wiping his hands on a rag. "What's going on?" "It's Cade," she said simply. "He's coming back, and I don't think he's coming alone." Frank's expression hardened, and he nodded. "I'll make some calls," he said. "We'll be ready." As Riley leaned against the workbench, the weight of the coming fight pressed down on her. She had hoped she'd never need to rely on her old skills again, but now it seemed there was no other choice. Frank's workshop smelled of motor oil and old wood, the walls lined with tools and half-finished projects. Riley leaned against a workbench, arms crossed, as Frank shuffled to a corner where a dusty landline phone sat. He picked it up and began dialing, his expression set in a grim mask. "I've got a few folks I can call," he said, his voice steady. "Old-timers like me who've been itching for something to do. They'll back you up." Riley nodded, though her mind was already calculating the odds. A few veterans might help even the numbers, but Cade's gang wasn't just dangerous, they were unpredictable. Still, she wasn't about to face them alone. Frank's voice grew louder as he spoke to someone on the other end of the line. "Yeah, she's here," he said. "It's serious. Bring what you've got and be ready to move." He hung up a moment later, glancing back at Riley. "They'll be here in the morning." "Thanks, Frank," Riley said quietly. Frank stepped closer, his brow furrowed. "What's this all about, Riley? You've been hiding out in that diner for years, and now you're kicking hornets' nests. What gives?" "They didn't give me much of a choice," Riley replied. Her voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. "They came after the people in my diner. I wasn't going to stand by and let them hurt anyone." Frank studied her. for a moment, then nodded. "You've still got that fire," he said, "but this isn't just some bar fight. You're taking on a gang, and they're not going to stop until they've made an example out of you." "I know," Riley said, her jaw tightening. "That's why I need to hit them first." Frank arched an eyebrow. "You got a plan?" Riley unfolded her arms and began pacing the workshop, her mind racing. "Cade's got numbers, but he's overconfident. He'll expect me to wait, to be on the defensive. If we hit them before they're ready, we can take away their advantage." Frank rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "You're talking about going on the offensive." "Exactly," Riley said, "but we have to be smart about it. Hit them where it hurts and make it clear that coming after me or anyone else isn't worth the cost." Frank nodded slowly. "All right," he said. "We'll need gear, supplies, and a location." Riley pulled out a map from her bag, spreading it across the workbench. "Cade's gang operates out of an old auto shop on the outskirts of town," she explained, pointing to a spot on the map. "It's remote but not impossible to access. If we're careful, we can neutralize them without too much collateral damage." Frank frowned, but didn't argue. "I'll get the word out," he said, "but you'd better be sure about this, Riley. Once you go after them, there's no turning back." "I know," Riley replied, her voice unwavering, "but I'm not running anymore." As the night stretched on, the workshop became a hive of activity. Frank's friends began arriving, their faces weathered, but their spirits willing. They brought tools, equipment, and years of experience. Riley watched as they prepared, a small spark of hope igniting in her chest. She wasn't alone in this fight. For the first time in years, she felt like she had a purpose again. The sun had barely risen when Riley and the group gathered outside Frank's workshop. A collection of old trucks, motorcycles, and utility vans parked haphazardly in the gravel lot. The air was crisp, and the faint glow of dawn cast long shadows across the ground. Despite the early hour, everyone was alert, their faces set with determination. Frank stood at the front, his gruff voice cutting through the quiet. "We all know why we're here," he said, his tone serious. "These iron wolves think they can run roughshod over this town, but today we're going to show them they're wrong." Riley stepped forward, her sharp gaze moving over the small group. "This isn't just about me," she said, her voice steady but firm. "Cade and his gang have been terrorizing this town for too long. If we don't stop them now, they'll only get bolder." The group murmured in agreement, and Riley continued. "We're hitting their base. It's risky, but we've got the advantage of surprise. Frank's mapped out the shop. There's one main entrance, 2 side doors, and an open back lot where they keep their bikes. They won't expect us to come straight to them, but we need to move fast and stay sharp." Frank held up a set of old blueprints he'd dug out of storage, pointing to key areas. "Riley's team will take the front. Me and a couple others will circle around to the back and block off their escape. Once we're in, we focus on neutralizing their leaders and scattering the rest." "Neutralizing how?" one of the men asked, his voice uncertain. "Non-lethal if possible," Riley said, meeting his eyes. "We're here to end their reign, not start a bloodbath. But if they force our hand, don't hesitate to defend yourselves." The group nodded, the weight of her words settling over them. They split into teams, checking their equipment one last time. Riley slipped on a tactical vest she hadn't worn in years, the familiar weight grounding her. She tucked a pair of zip ties into her pocket and secured her combat knife at her side. By the time they reached the auto shop, the sun was fully up, casting harsh light over the dilapidated building. The Iron Wolves' bikes were lined up in the back lot, their chrome gleaming in the morning sun. A few gang members milled around outside, smoking and laughing, oblivious to the storm about. To hit them, Riley crouched behind an old dumpster, her team close behind. She raised a hand, signaling them to hold. They waited, the seconds stretching into what felt like hours, until the other teams were in position, when Frank's voice crackled over the walkie-talkie with a simple "go." Riley surged forward. She burst through the front door with her team, catching the bikers off guard. The chaos was immediate. Shouts, the clatter of overturned chairs, and the sound of boots pounding against concrete. Riley moved with precision, her training taking over. She disarmed one man with a swift kick, then used his own momentum to throw him to the ground. Another lunged at her, but she ducked and struck, sending him sprawling. In the backlot, Frank's team was cutting off their escape, slashing tires and blocking exits. The gang was trapped, their confidence crumbling as Riley's team systematically took control. Cade emerged from the office, his face twisted with rage. "Riley!" he bellowed, his voice echoing through the chaos. She turned to face him, her eyes narrowing. "It's over, Cade," she said, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade. But Cade wasn't ready to surrender. He charged at her, his fists raised, and Riley braced herself, ready for the final confrontation. Cade barreled toward Riley like a freight train, his fists clenched and his face twisted in fury. Riley stood her ground, her stance steady and her muscles coiled, ready to meet him head-on. As he swung wildly, she sidestepped, grabbing his arm and using his momentum to send him sprawling into a stack of old tires. "Stay down, Cade," she said, her voice low but commanding. "It's over." He scrambled to his feet, wiping blood from his mouth with the back of his hand. "Not a chance," he spat, his eyes blazing with defiance. He lunged again, this time more calculated, his movements quick and deliberate. Riley blocked his strikes, her hands moving with precision as she deflected each blow. Cade was strong, but his rage made him sloppy. She stayed calm, waiting for the right moment. When he overextended on a punch, she stepped in, driving her elbow into his ribs and forcing him to stumble back, gasping for breath. Around them, the chaos began to subside. Frank's team had corralled the remaining gang members, zip-tying their hands and herding them into a corner. The bikers' defiance had crumbled, replaced by confusion and fear as they realized the fight was slipping away. Cade wasn't ready to admit defeat. He grabbed a length of chain from a nearby workbench, swinging it with a feral snarl. Riley ducked under the first swing, the chain whipping through the air inches from her face. On the second swing, she caught it mid-arc, yanking it out of his hands with a sharp twist. The look in Cade's eyes shifted, a flicker of doubt crossing his face for the first time. "You don't get it, do you?" he growled, his voice hoarse. "This is my world, my rules. You can't just walk in here and take it all away." Riley tossed the chain aside, stepping closer. "Your world is built on fear and control," she said, her voice steady. "But that ends now. You don't scare me, and you're not scaring anyone else after today." Cade lunged again, but Riley was ready. She sidestepped and swept his legs out from under him, sending him crashing to the ground. Before he could recover, she planted a knee on his chest, pinning him down. "It's over," she repeated, leaning close so he could see the unwavering resolve in her eyes. For a moment, Cade struggled, his pride refusing to let him yield. But as he looked around, at his captured men, at the wreckage of his operation, something in him seemed to break. His body went limp, his head falling back against the floor with a groan. Riley stood, her heart pounding as she watched Cade's defeat sink in. She turned to Frank, who approached with a triumphant smirk. "Think he's finally had enough?" Frank asked. "I hope so," Riley replied, though her tone was cautious. The gang was subdued, their stronghold dismantled. But Riley knew this wasn't just about Cade. It was about showing the world that fear didn't have to win, and the fight for that was just beginning. The aftermath was strangely quiet. Cade and his men sat in the corner of the auto shop, their hands bound with zip ties, their faces bruised and defeated. Frank and the others stood watch, their expressions a mixture of relief and triumph. Riley paced the floor, her mind still sharp and focused, despite the adrenaline fading from her system. She stopped in front of Cade, who glared up at her with a smoldering resentment that didn't quite mask the defeat in his eyes. "You had your chance to walk away," she said, her voice calm but firm. "You chose this." Cade didn't respond. His jaw was clenched tight, his pride too wounded to speak. Riley turned to Frank. "Call the sheriff," she said. "It's time to clean this up." Frank nodded and stepped outside to make the call, leaving Riley to face the remnants of the Iron Wolves. The gang members shifted uneasily under her gaze. They looked lost now, their bravado stripped away, replaced by uncertainty. "You've got a choice," Riley said, addressing them all. "You can keep following him, she motioned toward Cade, and keep ending up in places like this. Or you can figure out how to do something better with your lives. That's up to you. The younger ones avoided her gaze, but a few older members seemed to take her words to heart. She didn't wait for an answer. That wasn't her responsibility. By the time the sheriff arrived with his deputies, the sun was high, casting stark shadows over the scene. The lawmen took the gang members into custody, loading them into the back of their vehicles. The sheriff, a grizzled man named McCall, approached Riley, tipping his hat. "Looks like you saved me a lot of trouble," McCall said. "Again." Riley gave a small nod. "Just doing what needed to be done." McCall studied her for a moment, then chuckled. "You've got a habit of doing what needs to be done, Harper. Maybe this town's lucky to have you around." "Maybe," Riley said quietly. As the squad cars pulled away, Frank and the others began cleaning up the aftermath, piling up discarded weapons and clearing debris. Riley stood apart from them for a moment, staring at the empty lot where the gang's bikes had once been lined up. The fight was over, but the ripples it would leave behind were just beginning. Over the next few weeks, word of what had happened spread. The Iron Wolves' defeat wasn't just a victory for Riley, it became a symbol of resistance. Veterans, inspired by her actions, started reaching out to each other, forming groups to help their communities instead of tearing them apart. Slowly, a movement began to take shape, one grounded in strength, discipline, and purpose. At the diner, life returned to normal, or as normal as it could be. Regulars came and went, exchanging smiles and small talk. Riley poured coffee for a young veteran who had recently moved to town. As she set the cup down, the sleeve of her shirt shifted slightly, revealing the faint outline of her Delta Force tattoo. The veteran noticed, his eyes lighting up with recognition. "You served?" he asked. Riley hesitated for a moment, then gave a small nod. "Yeah," she said simply. "Thanks," he said, his voice filled with genuine gratitude. Riley smiled, a quiet satisfaction settling over her. She wasn't just a soldier anymore, and she wasn't just a waitress. She was someone who could make a difference, one cup of coffee and one act of courage at a time.